right, so welcome everybody. This is Myth of the 20th Century. Today we're going to be talking about a book by a guy from Argentina who saw the country go through what many call the Great Argentinian Depression, starting roughly in 1998 and then ending in 2002, which included a large banking collapse, default, and currency devaluation. And so the consequence of that was people obviously couldn't get their money, people lost their jobs, and the country was in turmoil. There were riots, the president had to step down, and so this is his story. He basically had to figure out how to survive in a country that was falling apart. And so we thought that we would cover this right before the 2016 American election, just in case. You never know. So we thought we could hopefully learn something. I don't know if there's much time to avoid this.
Yeah, there's no breaks on this train.
No, but we're individuals at the very least. So hopefully we can try to glean something, regardless of whether our politicians care about us or represent us. So that's what we're going to talk about. So, Mr. Anderson, you read this book. If you could maybe give an outline of how this whole thing started for this guy, and then where did he end up, and we can just go from there.
Right. So this book is interesting because it kind of differs from the main strain of American survivalist literature, which heavily emphasizes basically grabbing your SKS and going into the woods to your compound. This gentleman, Ferfal, lived through this economic collapse in Argentina and sort of distinguishes it from a lot of the scenarios that are typically described in American survivalist literature. So one of the things that he describes is that this was kind of universal in geographic extent. It hit the cities, but it also hit the countryside particularly hard. If you're in a farming community and suddenly your crops aren't worth anything, or you can't import the machinery or the fertilizer or the seeds or whatever that you need in order to grow your crops, the countryside also goes through this great economic depression. You also have kind of a universal severity that hits the countryside harder. So he describes what some other people have described in, for instance, South Africa or Zimbabwe, where because the rural areas were particularly isolated and far from governmental control, when the government was trying to either enforce or restore order, they obviously focused on the cities first because it was easier, but also because that's where their tax base actually lives and where they all have houses. So he contended that, although you did not see, as much immediate kind of lawlessness in rural areas, what you did see was 12 hungry guys go and raid a farmhouse, kill everybody inside, rape the livestock, steal the women, etc. So almost all of his advice is oriented towards what he believed was the most prudent course of action, which was essentially shelter in place wherever you happen to be or wherever you happen to have the best social circle available. So that essentially means suburbs. You don't quit your job and run to the hills. You keep going to your job, but you're very careful not to get carjacked. And when you get home, you're very careful about not letting people in, about keeping a good watch out, not falling victim to kidnappings or these virtual kidnappings, but generally how to sort of maintain as much normalcy as possible until the government is ultimately able to restore order, which they actually did in Argentina. So we can talk not necessarily so much about his specific advice about what you should do in that situation, because that ends up being a laundry list. But I thought it might be nice to kind of describe sort of that collapse model and how likely it is in the U.S., what that would imply in a U.S.ian circumstance, and what the sort of other collapse models might be and how those might shake out.
So my understanding of Argentina is that it's very concentrated around Buenos Aires, at least the economy is. That's the major port, that's where the government is, that's where the business capital is, and I assume that's where the banks are. And so if there's going to be any control of the country, it's going to start there. The United States, though, it's a little bit more distributed, and it is bigger. Argentina is large as well, but I think the concentration is a little bit different. And
well,
so I
that's
wonder
interesting, because concentration kind of has a lot of different dimensions. Like, a lot of the U.S. is heavily dependent on centralized food distribution facilities, for instance, that blanket entire states.
Yeah, it's regional though. I mean, it's not like you can't get food if you're cut off from Vermont milk producers. I mean, you'll be able to find a secondary source. There's multiple supply chains, I think, that are redundant in the United States, but that's just for food. I just meant more for command and control centers and things like that. There are major cities throughout the country that are kind of, I mean, you have Texas, you have the East Coast, you have the West Coast, you have Chicago, the Midwest. I think this country is so unique in that it's really large and it's got a lot of people. I'm curious to see what would happen in something like this. I mean, we had Hurricane Katrina. That wasn't a political problem; it was a natural disaster, and so but that region suffered. It wasn't affecting the whole country.
I think that probably what distinguishes the United States from Argentina, certainly from the former Soviet Union, which had a similar experience, is that we have very, very few people involved in farming, especially in outside of the Swipple. Maybe some Swipple areas have some back to the farm type movements, but like in the South, in the Midwest, you don't have people. Everything's industrial farming, and I imagine in Argentina it's more like, I live in Buenos Aires, but mom and dad still live back at the farm.
You're probably right about that. We're more dependent on supplies of food as a population, probably compared to a place like Argentina, where there are more family farms. That is pretty much the origin, I think, of the country's economic growth in the 19th century. It was agriculture. It wasn't anything else. There was no minerals to export, and so they grew by basically having, in some ways, like the United States, but without a lot of industrial development afterwards, compared to the United States at least. They had a lot of frontiersmen going out and settling, and I think they retained that. That was sort of their comparative advantage. So you're probably right about that. But does Ferfal talk about people just growing their own food and just disconnecting from the grid? Is that something that happened, or?
Out in the country you were kind of forced to, but he does actually talk about, specifically in the farming context, Argentina has a lot of the same things going on as the U.S. because it is a major kind of agricultural power. And he makes the point that a lot of the rural areas are very specialized in what they farm. So, just like Nebraska, if you measure it in terms of raw calories, sure, it's like a fantastic breadbasket, but they're mostly growing just acres and acres and acres of wheat and corn, which isn't necessarily something that you can live off of in the long term. And if you have a problem transporting that to market, you'll see a lot of kind of crops rotting in the fields, millions of calories and no way to get them to hungry people type scenario. Especially because growing these sort of diversity crops, I guess you could say, just a little bit of tomatoes, a little bit of zucchini or whatever, it tends to be very labor intensive. And if your hypothesis is that rural areas are getting kind of hollowed out, then that labor may not be available. So in the Soviet 1930s scenario, what actually happened was that they had a very confiscatory policy towards the rural areas, where they would just go and basically grab all of their wheat for export, to the point where they were actually having famines in the Ukraine. And the rural areas, basically, you had reverse refugees. They were fleeing the countryside and moving to the cities because that's where there was at least some prospect of getting some stable food supplies. So in the U.S., we're very decentralized, but I wonder, even on these sort of macro regional bases, if the supply chains are fragile enough that they could be disrupted to a point where you would actually see some amount of food insecurity.
You probably would if there was a major loss of government control. I think that's basically, unless we had foreign troops obviously running around, which I don't envision.
No.
It's just too hard of a place to invade given our neighbors, and then doing that by water would be too difficult. But I think you would have maybe civil unrest or even civil war if things got really, really bad. In that scenario, I think you would have some breakdowns, and there would be stock-out situations of certain items. It's an interesting question, though, as to how that would play out. If anybody is ever really autistic about this, they can go and read some of the declassified military plans from the 70s that talk about what would happen in a nuclear war, and the provisioning that was put in place to have caches of resources and maintaining logistics in such an event. I think it was floating around the internet a couple of years ago. I picked one up. But
interestingly enough, the U.S. does maintain some pretty large stockpiles of foodstuffs, particularly around St. Louis, I think, that has the huge limestone caves originally used for brewing. That's where they literally store all of their literal government cheese, in those cool underground caves.
Is that classified? Or that's common knowledge?
No, that's common knowledge. And they actually, these caves are so huge that a lot of private companies use them as well. They own various parts of them.
I was going to ask about that. I had wondered if we'd, with Russia in the news not too long ago with their massive, national nuclear drill, I'd wondered what we were doing.
Yeah, nothing.
At no point in my life have I ever had any sort of nuclear preparedness drill. I've never heard about any sort of...
Well, we were taught in school that duck and cover was foolish, so that's the extent of our nuclear education.
Exactly, yeah.
The interesting thing about these centralized caches is that they kind of require people to actually know about them and to kind of actually do their jobs and distribute this stuff. So, for instance, in Hurricane Katrina, the New Orleans Police Department is notoriously corrupt. So it's maybe not universally applicable, but you did see a lot of their kind of emergency resources, they got the hell out of Dodge and screw anybody who wasn't quite as prepared as they were. So I would not maintain...
So the police basically become kind of a gang almost, and they sort of look after themselves first and their families, which makes sense.
Yeah, that's libertarian theory 101. Just another gang, man.
My first reaction to that is to say, well, the New Orleans police force was something well over 50% black.
Oh yeah.
But when I think of the cops that I know, the white cops in New England that I know, if we had a nuclear war or a local disaster, they would do the same thing. They would just be for themselves.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. I don't think that our country is, or if it ever was like this, is a high trust society anymore. I really just, you go to any grocery store or mega mall, and you just look around, and you just, I don't know. I mean, people could probably delude themselves otherwise, but just my gut has told me, frankly, ever since Katrina, that was a big wake up call, that we are just not a nation. We're just a homogenous or a heterogeneous group of people that shop. And if that's the American dream, that's pretty pathetic.
Well, that kind of brings up an interesting thing as well, is that it doesn't actually require like this sort of like unintentional run to the hills. Like, depending on which scenario you believe, it's extremely common in other kinds of large civil conflicts. The Middle East being the most recent example, but also the Ukraine to some extent. Like, use of food distribution as a weapon against a problem population is fairly widespread. So if you have a city that's kind of a notorious hotbed of unrest, they just simply don't get the grain trucks that week.
Right, that makes sense. Do you have any specific examples of that happening? Is that in Syria or Ukraine?
Yeah, Syria, that was fairly common. Or it still is fairly common, depending on which cities you're talking about. And I believe when the Ukraine fronts were a little bit more mobile, that was discussed. Of course, that could have been propaganda, but that was sort of used.
Well, I think in the Middle East that would be particularly effective because they have only a few key regions that produce food, and they probably import most of it.
Oh, yeah.
And so, historically they used to grow it in the Fertile Crescent, but now with oil they buy everything and they export oil. So Ukraine probably is a little bit better off in that situation. What about in Argentina, again, going back there, what about things like electricity? Did the power grid go down? Or
yeah, so this kind of follows the same pattern where it's not like the power is out and you never get power again. It's like power is unreliable. So you might get, N hours of electricity with occasional brownouts, and N just kind of keeps decreasing.
Now, why was that happening? I mean, were people not able to afford their utility bills, or people just weren't going to work?
No, usually they just kind of stop caring about utility bills, and that's one of the drivers. It's more about literally not being able, like the state-owned power company, like has trouble like ensuring reliable sources of fuel oil for their generators or of natural gas or whatever. So they also suffer from like shortages of spare parts. The common theme here is that it's all stuff that kind of requires long supply chains and foreign currency in order to get. So the U.S. has similar dependencies. We make a lot of this stuff, a lot more than Argentina, obviously. But there are particular vulnerabilities that people talk about, particularly around like large power transformers, like the big step-up ones that go from the long-distance transmission lines to the local
now you're
grids.
talking about terrorism or just attacks.
Well, I mean, in a natural disaster situation where, like, you had a couple of those, struck by lightning or swallowed by the sea or whatever, and the question is how long until the grid is back up.
That's just a one-off situation, though.
Sure.
I mean, Argentina was an ongoing crisis.
Right.
So.
But, I mean, these things do require some amount of, like, maintenance. Aside from that, you have things like, generators wear out and need replacements, various, like, electronic components in the control infrastructure. Like, you can't just kind of set it and forget it. You kind of need some amount of people who know what they're doing and have resources to actually maintain it.
I think the United States would be much better off from an electricity point of view because we do have domestic energy reserves, and in terms of foreign currency, I mean, the dollar still is amazingly considered the best currency they have around the world. And so in terms of like a inability to import, that would require
Yeah, I would be
massive
surprised.
Coordination from OPEC and Russia and China.
I'm fairly certain
us.
that we're a net oil exporter now. Or
in finished products, we are. I'm not sure about petroleum products. I'm not sure about the raw crude. But
yeah, like if you just kind of opened up the tap and like assumed a oil price of like $120 a barrel, then you like ramped up North Dakota production, etc., and you would end up being fine. Like we still have like more coal than anybody else. We've got a bunch of uranium.
So the
gasification.
Have there been so in terms of just a physical capability? I don't think the U.S. would have a problem. But what about in terms of as a means of control? You mentioned the food supplies being used as a lever against the population. Are there any instances that anybody in this group knows of where the power grid was used in a similar way?
I mean, we tend to like blow up the electrical grid whenever we attack a country.
Right. That's true. So
like,
if there's a civil war, that's probably what would happen.
I mean, it's a question of kind of what advantage does that give you? Like, if you have to like
pretty big,
like focus on like blowing up the grid. I mean, mostly that's just like people can't do all the stuff that we use electricity for, but that doesn't necessarily help or hinder your military operations.
Sure, it does. It hinders the civilian capability substantially.
That's
true. Think about if there is sort of an insurrection going on, and you're in the middle of winter. You cut the energy grid down for the Midwest.
Yeah, electric heat is
that is a very vulnerable population. I mean, that's what happened in World War II in Leningrad, Petrograd. I can't remember what they were calling it at the time, but St. Petersburg now. Mm-hmm. That place got cut off.
Leningrad.
Yeah, and that place got cut off, and people were just starving to death, dying, and they had to send in all these crazy supplies over the ice, and there's a lot of documentaries about that. But yeah, the Nazis were sieging it basically, and they were in the middle of winter, and they were suffering big time.
Yeah, they were eating babies. That's how they won the Hero City designation after the war. They really went through unbelievable suffering.
Yeah, it lasted for years, right? I mean, it was multi-year siege.
Until 1944, yeah.
So it sounds like, there are a lot of structural kind of advantages that the U.S. has economically in terms, or like along dimensions that would allow us to be more resilient than Argentina in the event of like some giant oil embargo, even if the U.S. dollar wasn't, kind of supported anymore by its status as a reserve currency. Just as a complete autarky, we do kind of okay on a macro scale, probably. Thank you. But we kind of have a approximate example of a miniature economic collapse that could have turned mega in the kind of housing collapse.
Oh yeah, big time.
And if we kind of look at some of those trends and extrapolate them to had nobody kind of intervened in the market, obviously like the major dimension of that was like foreclosures, to the point where like you had people kind of worrying about entire neighborhoods getting hollowed out, banks like not being physically able to like process all the foreclosures reasonably, so you had a bunch of people kind of living basically rent free with all the problems that engenders. If you saw something in the U.S. where like interest rates, like the standard like economic scenario is like China is like, we don't need any stinking T-bills. So the U.S. is
the Fed will buy them.
Well, right. Like either the Fed prints money and buys them, or we jack up interest rates sky high in an attempt to attract more investors. But
it's not going to happen.
Yeah. So I mean, you see, some amount of large scale actual inflation that wipes out savers and makes creditors much better off if you have a mortgage and a government job, say. how does that kind of end up playing out on a macro scale in the U.S. if you hypothesized about just 20% inflation suddenly?
Hyperinflation's, well, that's 20% inflation isn't really in the area of hyperinflation.
Yeah, let's start with the more moderate scenario.
Inflation is, it's not great, but the great social cataclysm usually comes in deflations. So there's the 1933 deflation. That's kind of the bottom of the Great Depression. And what happened in 1933? The Nazis came to power. Fascists rose to power in Hungary in the 1930s, and in
just about in everywhere, like Poland,
all
Hungary,
over Europe, in China. And then there's a scenario in China. I forget the dates, but it involves basically Roosevelt buying up silver. Buying silver. China uses a silver-backed currency, boosts the value of their currency, causes deflation. Deflation is actually a much bigger threat than inflation, and of course, the last recession was deflationary. If it didn't quite bring about actual deflation, it brought about a much slower inflation.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is such a credit-driven economy that deflation would hit us particularly hard if you look at consumer debt levels. I haven't seen a credible. I haven't seen a credible scenario though that some exogenous shock that would actually lead to deflation in the U.S. What's the kind of standard scenario there?
I've got one for you. I've got a great one for you.
Oh, please do.
Donald Trump wins on Tuesday.
I like the way this is going.
And Janet Yellen says, wow, interest rates have been low for quite a while, and we have all these assets we've bought up. We really should unwind some of that. And so she starts moving interest rates up, and she starts selling some of these assets the Fed has accumulated, and the U.S. dollar goes through the roof. It's already very high, and it goes through the roof, and nominal GDP growth either declines or nominal GDP falls outright, and all of a sudden all of us are, I don't know about all of us, but
okay,
Americans
so an exogenous rise in interest rates from Fed, switching from the accelerator to the brake, kind of very harshly.
And the economy is already actually very weak in terms of nominal growth, in terms of the growth rate in broad money indices, things like that. We're not on the cusp of recession, but I could totally see a scenario where the Fed pulls a 2008 again, and fails to cut interest rates after Lehman Brothers collapses, and puts the U.S. into a disinflationary recession. To discredit Trump could happen.
Yeah, it seems like that would kind of immediately lead to a regardless of how that would play out,
if I were Trump, I would nationalize the freaking Fed at that point. Say, hey, you're fired, get out.
Supremacy clause.
He's already
the Germans did.
He's already named the Fed.
Yeah. But regardless of the kind of just kind of, say that takes a while. In the context of deflationary spiral, so asset prices deflate. So bond prices deflate. If you have an adjustable rate mortgage, that gets much more expensive. So you might see kind of another hollowing out. If you own debt that's denominated or that's linked to interest rates. I'm trying to think that asset prices have been.
Is that the money supply falls, and
right?
There's not enough money to pay the debts.
I guess retirees.
If bond prices go up, interest rates go down, and debt becomes cheaper. But the big risk is that there's not enough money to pay all the debts that we've accumulated, and we have a highly indebted society.
Well, do we want to talk about Argentina, going back to the book, because they did have a banking crisis, and I understand that Argentina is different than the United States, so it may not be completely relevant, but from my reading of what the government and the banks did in Argentina was that they essentially they told all the savers that their deposits are now no longer redeemable for U.S. dollars. They're only redeemable for pesos. And so effectively they lost about half their savings. So that was kind of a really harsh, rapid financial repression, which is the term that floats around the United States, which is essentially what has happened here slowly by essentially having negative real interest rates and losing money every year by having your money in the bank. I mean, my bank pays me 0.01% interest, okay, and inflation is more than that, so it's ridiculous. But it's not 50% overnight. That's what happened in Argentina. But did Ferfal talk at all about that stuff, and do we think that is applicable to the United States?
He mentions like that specific kind of instance, and so it doesn't necessarily generalize that well because you have this problem where like it was kind of a dual currency regime almost, where a lot of people had their mortgages denominated in dollars. So suddenly they had much less ability to pay.
Did they just default? What did they do?
I think a lot of them just defaulted.
Say sorry.
It's like, hey, here's your house. Like, good luck. Go fuck yourself.
Yeah,
like,
that's what I would do.
See you in the breadline tomorrow.
So ridiculous.
But I mean, the U.S. The only scenario that kind of leads to that is like a Euro style mail-in, so to speak, where instead of dollars in your bank account, you now own shares in J.P. Morgan. We, as a mechanism to recapitalize the banks, I don't know how possible that would be in the U.S. Without a lot of dead bankers.
Gosh.
I mean, the Fed can easily recapitalize the banks in the event of a, I don't know, I mean, whatever say the Fed does cause a recession by tightening money or whatever it is, but they can create money, right? So
right,
they nationalize the banks and then.
Oh yeah, I remember reading Brad DeLong's blog, who's a professor at Berkeley, and he and this was like 2008, 9 or something, and he's like nationalize the banks now. So there definitely were from liberal academics even calls to do that. So unless they just can't stand the president, in theory, they would support that. Who knows? Who the hell knows, man?
Yeah, it's always difficult kind of tracking the ripple effects down to the kind of micro consumer level from something like that because, if your deposit is no longer in like J.P. Morgan or Bank of America, but just like, the like mega bank of Mega America, does that have like significant kind of ripple effects? Like, obviously, it sucks if you've like invested a lot in bank stocks for some reason. Like, how much like of the kind of collapsing the like completely inflated balance sheets of like major banks? Like, how much of that would actually ripple down to the average bloke with bank deposits?
I mean, in my view, almost every bank in the U.S. could fail. It wouldn't be good. It would be a crazy time. The stock market would fall and everything. But as long as the Fed controls these tokens that we use, these green tokens that we use to track who owes whom what, and as long as they keep the money supply growing at a steady, predictable rate, anything can happen. Almost anything can happen, and you're not going to have a Russia in the 1990s type scenario.
So it's interesting that the U.S. has this incredible consumer debt burden. We also have a large federal government debt burden. Like I've read that, is it a third of receipts, tax receipts, or a third of the budget goes to interest on the debt currently?
That sounds about right. Yeah,
it's one or the other. I mean, either way, it's not particularly.
Well, when I was in high school,
I thought it was about a quarter.
Yeah, when I was in high school, it was like 10%. I'd be surprised if it was a third, but it could be. I mean, I would expect it to be more. It's got to be more.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. Treasury issuance is something like 105 to 115% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
So it's and just this year, I think we added something like $13,000 per citizen to our national debt. It's just like unbelievable amounts. I mean, if an individual added $13,000 to their personal debt, that would be a bad year. Unsecured debt, that would be a bad year.
Well, it's not totally unsecured, Goy. We own the taxing power.
That's good. Yeah, I suppose we could sell Yellowstone to the Chinese.
Well, in the 80s, they were going to sell part of Yosemite to the Japanese. I wouldn't be surprised if Hillary tries to sell something.
Yeah, so the effect that I'm interested in, as far as a rise in interest rates, like that would make people with kind of rotating credit card debt much worse off. A lot of them would probably default, boohoo. People with ARMs, adjustable rate mortgages, but also like the effect on the federal budget, like that would immediately kind of, if interest rates double, that would take a little bit of time for it to kind of sink in, because most of your debt is like 20-year treasury bills. Their average maturity is probably like pretty high because of all the debt we've been issuing. So it wouldn't be immediate, but you would see like ever increasing kind of resources go to paying off the debt. Financialization.
But let me just say one thing about this. I mean, I don't think interest rates. Maybe we should just get back to how to get food out of a garden in Argentina. But I don't think interest rates go up without nominal spending also going up to push them up. And if nominal spending goes up, nominal GDP, then government tax receipts go up with it. I mean, it's very rare to actually have a default in an inflationary environment. Usually they happen in a deflationary environment. That's, Argentina went through the ringer because they were pegged to the dollar. And, they only broke that link in, I think, 2001. That's actually when their sort of situation got better. It was after they kicked off a bit of an inflation.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just using that as an inroad to talk about, like, say your taxes went up, like, substantially for one reason or another. Whether that's to kind of deal with, like, a budget hole or because...
I don't think it's that likely.
We're going full Bernie.
I think the lesson of the past 30 years is that the Democrats increase spending and Republicans cut taxes, but they don't balance the budget, and I think that trend will continue. And that basically just means we're going to have deficits after deficits. And if Trump tries to change that, he'll get blamed for a slowdown in the economy. So I think he'll probably chicken out. I really doubt he'll be able to pay for it. I mean, he says he's going to pay for it with taxes on imports. I don't know. I hope that works, but I really kind of doubt it.
His best bet is to do whatever it takes to get the Fed to boost the economy a little bit and increase money supply growth.
Even more than it already is. I mean,
no, dude. If you look at the monetary base. I mean, first of all, we're paying interest on the monetary base.
Well, he might go after infrastructure. He might actually build, a fifth Hoover Dam. I mean, for God's sakes, I wouldn't even mind that.
The point is that inflation is low and nominal income growth / nominal spending growth. It's two sides of the same coin. They're both low. Like, the economy can handle more demand.
Okay.
And
so
he needs to step on the balls, twist the balls of the Fed, and get some nominal spending growth. I mean, we have like 3.5% nominal GDP growth.
So what I'm taking away from this whole conversation is that, like, the U.S. has a lot of levers to prevent, like, the specific scenario that Argentina went through.
Yeah.
Like, we have a, like, large reserve currency. All of our debt is dollar denominated. We have, like, natural resources that, like, don't make it totally necessary for us to import, like, at least basic materials. So maybe we can kind of switch gears and talk about kind of other plausible scenarios that might lead to a Farfal light situation.
Well, I
think there are a lot. I mean, we could
this.
have an EMP attack. We could have the Yellowstone caldera go off. We could have a limited nuclear exchange. There's all sorts of things that could cause the U.S. to, have some sort of social disruption.
Let's each list our most the one that we think is most plausible.
Okay. Who wants to go first?
I'll start. California earthquake.
Okay.
It's like something like a 1% chance every year of the big one hitting.
We'll bounce back from that. It's happened before.
Well, depending on how big of a big one you're talking, like, Seattle basically slides into the sea. San Francisco's leveled.
We'll bounce back. That's fine.
Sure, and California probably has the lowest social capital of any state in the country.
Probably.
Oh, sure.
Well,
yeah,
I don't know. Florida's pretty bad. But,
Florida's bad too. Florida's bad too.
But yeah, I know
There's
what
at
you're
least
saying.
Christians in Florida, though.
Yeah, the panhandle just kind of seals off the degenerates to the south, and
and the Cubans are a community, But California is just it's like, sorry, but it's some of the worst aspects of the U.S.
Washington D.C. might have lower levels of, but
Yes,
they've got a
York
shitload
City,
of Manhattan.
I think DC's the worst.
I guess if you're talking about like state level, then California is notable in that like all of its major regions are fairly. I guess maybe like specifically NorCal would do okay, but.
Okay, so Ajax, what's your number one? Don't say the caldera. That's come on.
All right, no caldera, but I would say a nuclear war.
Okay, why? Why do you think that's likely?
I don't know that it's likely, but I just don't think it's. I mean, you keep running this Monte Carlo over and over again. Every year we have these countries with intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarines, and we keep getting lucky. I don't know. I don't know that some asshole in China doesn't put his elbow on the wrong key and accidentally launch an ICBM, so to speak.
So are you picturing a limited sort of nuclear exchange where Minnow Air Force Base gets leveled?
Yeah, even if it's limited. Let's say China shoots 20 ICBMs at us and we shoot 50 back at them, and then somehow it stops. We lose. This country hasn't really suffered in like 80 years. We lose 2-3 cities to a nuclear exchange, and I think we start eating each other. I think we lose our minds.
Yeah.
I mean, I see these people around me, and they're not the saltiest crew, I mean, they're born to shop. They're atomized and they're born to shop, and or it could be. Here's my second. Can I give my second?
Yeah.
All right, a flu.
That's a good one.
A 1918 flu.
Right. The only reason I don't think that's as big of a threat is because I think everybody can get on board with, okay, flu of that type is bad, and I think people would cooperate and do what they're told. I don't think there would be any sort of mass protests against the government trying to control that situation. But, who knows? But the nuclear one, that one's tricky. We've never really seen that either. But essentially that, I don't know. I mean, after 9/11, the country seemed to sort of pull together, quote unquote, and go in one direction. Whether that was a good direction or not is obviously extremely debatable. The nuclear war one is, for me, it's not so much the society itself will fight itself. It's just we're going to be in a really bad situation, and that's it. I mean, I don't think you can have 20 ICBMs landing on this country and call that a limited exchange. That's not going to be the end of it. That's
it really depends on where they land and what their yield is. Like, they're so like the variance.
You think we would negotiate at that point? I think there would be some pretty big exchanges.
No, I mean, yeah, like specific scenarios get like really tricky. Like, like China is kind of a specific circumstance in that they only have like about 50 nukes that can actually hit the U.S. God only knows where their target is.
Why would they do that?
There would
I
be
don't
no
see
good
China
reason.
doing that. I don't see Russia doing it. I see maybe tactical nukes being used in a European theater with Russia, maybe.
Or just like the standard, North Korea nukes Tokyo, or like Pakistan and India go at it.
But it could be an accident.
Yeah.
It could be an accident.
I mean, accidents are like the thing that's more likely that you have like, one missile go off for like a squadron.
One nuke hits one nuke that's programmed to hit anywhere in the U.S.
I don't think
that
they're that.
Launch.
I don't think China's that incompetent. I mean, I actually think they're probably.
I mean, our Navy presumably.
Yeah,
supposedly
honestly,
blew up,
the U.S. is more likely
TWA
to have a
Flight
whoopsie.
800. I mean, someone just blew it up accidentally when they were doing a drill.
Yeah.
It could happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you. It's
But
interesting going through the scenarios.
That's like, so if you kind of assume that it's kind of the probability is like probability times severity is like fairly linear and decreasing, I guess, maybe even like log linear and decreasing. That like the absolute likeliest thing is that like some commander has a whoopsie and accidentally drops something.
Well, guys, I don't think strategic nuclear weapons are going to be used unless there is already a ongoing brushfire war or a hot war between the superpowers using conventional weapons. I only think strategic nuclear weapons would be used after that starts up. So we're not in that situation. But what I do think could start something is a cyber attack or a EMP, and they could be combined, basically, because they would have very similar effects. But I don't know how likely that is. That is just an unknown. But I think cyber attack is probably the most likely because it's very hard to trace.
Your pick for scenario?
No. I think, well, it could be. But I actually don't think the other superpowers want to go to war with the United States. I think the globalists, if you want to call them that, who run the banks and a lot of the major corporations, and at least the CEOs who run the corporations, want to continue the policy of globalization, and they may try to discredit the right, and so the nationalists basically, and so that's their main enemy because they want open borders, free trade, which basically gives them cheap labor and a more docile electorate that they can manipulate through the media and through the monetary system. And so what I think the most likely thing that I envision is more of this low-scale George Soros bullshit like BLM and Femin and Occupy Wall Street basically being used to manipulate elections around the world. And if there is a Donald Trump presidency, that will, I think, kick off to discredit him further. And the media will kick into even higher gear, if that's even possible. They're already at gear 21 on a 21-speed bike, and I don't know, they'd have to add an extra axle or something. But basically, I think that's the most likely thing. And then you'd have sort of like civil unrest and just more bullshit.
That's an interesting. There's a kind of view of history that was essentially exactly what happened in the 1960s and 70s. That there was a semi-official policy of essentially anarcho-tyranny that resulted in hollowing out the very valuable U.S. inner cities, ethnically cleansing them of whites, and dispersing that population to the suburbs. So, yeah, I like, given that there's kind of immediate historical precedent and like a lot of actors that have that kind of in their interest, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw something like that, except for the way that I would imagine that it would go down. Like, you're no longer talking about kind of hollowing out, Manhattan per se. What you're talking about is hollowing out essentially like suburban areas like Ferguson or these sort of targeted refugee resettlements where, surprise, St. Cloud now has 50,000 Somalis, or, busing Syrians into Boise.
See, this is what's interesting. That's possible under a Hillary presidency. But under Trump, I think he would stop that or slow it down substantially. But the strategy that you just laid out is what Obama and even George W. Bush was doing that too. He was doing that in I think it was in Minnesota or something. He started the importation of Somalis. And a lot of people don't know that, but Obama just continued it and probably ramped it up quite a bit. But that is a globalist agenda right there, because they're trying to diminish any sort of cohesiveness of the nation and basically put people in straitjackets, essentially, with their kill words, the racist accusation.
And that's interesting, just to bring it full circle, because that actually does start to look like the Ferfal collapse situation, where instead of like basically a loss of financial capital causing this kind of breakdown in social order, you have like an intentional depletion of social capital, but essentially the same like ground level symptoms. Like suddenly you have to worry about getting carjacked on your way to work. You have to worry about like not parking anything too nice in your driveway, or you'll get your house robbed.
That's gonna continue whether Hillary or Trump gets in, because the powers that be, the media and the financial system and the deep state, regardless of Trump being there, he's unfortunately just a little bit more than a figurehead if he does get in. And so the deep state is essentially all the bureaucracy that hates him, with the exception of the FBI and maybe the CIA. The CIA is, who knows, but they seem to have been trying to discredit Clinton this past couple weeks, which is encouraging. But they are going to, the establishment, let's put it that way, they're going to still be there, and they're going to still continue this policy of trying to break the nation up. And yeah, I think that's going to be sort of what America is going to start looking like. It's going to start looking like Brazil.
Yes.
Which is really unfortunate.
It'll be like Rio, where when you go down the stairs,
yeah,
and you're about ready to open the door,
yeah,
onto the street, you brace yourself and you make sure the taxi's already there.
Well, South Africa is like the poster child for like a kind of slow glide collapse that ends up in a power dive, like basically from 1992 to present. Or like that accelerated by like 10 years or so in Rhodesia / Zimbabwe. And of course, like, they had a far worse demographic situation, but that's, that's the kind of end game. Like, if you talk about like an event of maximum severity, that's what it starts to look like.
Right. Yeah,
sure.
Rhodesia is probably the worst.
As we discuss this, I think of a certain fact that I heard last week about Sweden. And it might be that Germany or Sweden are closer to having to deal with one of these problems than we are, as a country where many people have firearms, and it's a huge place. It's spread out. The Swedes apparently have had and I tried to find data on this. I couldn't find the data, but they've had anecdotally massive amount of police resigning recently. Okay, and Sweden is actually undergoing levels of immigration that have really never been seen before. They're even higher than the U.S. in the sort of World War I, pre-World War I era.
That's astonishing.
Kind of per capita basis, and it's not Italians and Hungarians that are coming in, right? It's like the worst people in the world are coming in, and the police in Sweden can't handle it.
Yeah, they're probably about a couple of elections, maybe at most, from forming what's the preferred nomenclature right now? Some prank squads.
We'll see.
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. Well, what is it? The Sons of Odin in Finland have been wearing their biker jackets and doing little low-scale actions. But I think the Swedish Democrats are, if not the largest party, one of the largest parties now in Sweden.
They're probably the largest party, but
they went from 2% to like 25-30%. It's
European social dynamics are like so far outside of my like area of expertise in terms of like how integrated their like security services are with like the general population, how politicized they are, like what the kind of like levers of control that their polity has over their citizens. Like I just have no good way of projecting like how that's going to go down.
Well, let's, if we can, talk a little bit more about Ferfal for a second, because assuming that this trend continues of the West being flooded intentionally by people who want to divide and conquer the entire population, we're going to have a very fractured society. and that could look a little bit like what Argentina went through. And so I want to ask, what does the individual do? Like, what skills are valuable aside from staying alive? How do you actually earn a living if you can't use the roads? I mean, were there any particular trades or skills that became in demand? Because there's a lot of people who talk about disaster preparation or bugging out, or talking about learning a trade, learning how to weld, learning how to repair a car. Does that stuff even factor into a real world scenario like Argentina?
I don't know that it does. Argentina, he specifically describes against that sort of preparing for a collapse by actually changing how you or your sort of mean interactions with society, probably just because you're not able to. If you're, in a moribund society, they have sufficient plumbers. It might have been a good idea for you to do that earlier, but it's not quitting your software job and taking up electrician work is going to be practical for you to do. The particular areas of growth tend to be in security services. I saw some economic paper that basically estimated deadweight loss of crime in various countries, one of which was Argentina, by looking at their growth in security sector employment. But that's not a fantastic job if you're actually needed, as opposed to just being a warm body.
Okay, so let's also talk about the police. So you mentioned security services. Were the police just absent without leave, and they were kind of even guns for hire? What happened? Or did people just have to take up their own defense?
Yeah, I mean, there's just, as he describes it, it's so they're not always your friend. They're not totally corrupt. I mean, it's just like everybody else, really. When there's a breakdown in social trust, they're in it for themselves.
Well, I'll be honest with you. The police where I live, frankly, don't do me much good other than containing outbursts of Black Lives Matter.
Right.
They will not come out to investigate a crime after the fact, and if it's ongoing, well, excuse me, Mr. Murderer, hold while I call the police. They will show up if it's ongoing, but that's about it. And it's okay, thanks a lot, guys.
In most areas, the police kind of do two things. They do kind of generic population suppression by things like investigating drug crimes, which surprise, surprise, what the effect of that is. It helps you to keep your problem population somewhat having a lid on them. And they also do kind of generic cleanup work, right. Which is most murders get solved because somebody stabbed somebody else over a card game and then bragged about it to all of his friends, in front of a room full of witnesses. It's not exactly a whoddunit.
Right. So basically what we're living with isn't maybe all that different than what happened in Argentina.
Yeah, I mean, it's if you combine a breakdown in social trust with that sort of pattern, police are just structurally ineffective at controlling crime unless you're using them basically to prosecute bullshit crimes as a way of keeping a particular population under control. You could have effectively the same impact on society by criminalizing dreadlocks. It's not
Giuliani style.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually the poster child for kind of police as a mechanism of population control. You eliminate freedom of movement for your problem population.
Okay, so that's another good question. How mobile were people during this collapse in Argentina?
Mobile how?
Well, let's say I want to go to the next town over versus
Sure.
I want to go to Buenos Aires. Like, what
Sure.
is that?
I mean, you
process?
hop in your car and you don't stop at stop signs, so you don't get carjacked. But like, people moved around, and of course, you got to buy gas too. But like, it wasn't a
Was
it wa-
gas available, or did
I-
you have to have that stockpiled?
You know, I don't recall him discussing that specifically. He discussed like the prudence of keeping a couple of jerry cans,
Yeah.
but I don't know if they had like shortages per se, or if it was just people were poorer and it was more expensive.
Right. Okay. But there weren't roadblocks or people trying to carjack you with because there are instances in parts of the world where that happens. Might even happen in Russia. But,
Well, it's like if there's something like a roadblock, like assuming that you haven't seen like a complete collapse, that's exactly the sort of like cleanup work that the cops theoretically do.
right.
But it's more like the old crib in the road thing, and then they jump you from the side, or like some weeping lady is knocking at your door at 2 a.m. talking about how she just got robbed, and you open the door and then you get jumped, that sort of thing. But it's like it's effectively doesn't actually sound that much more dangerous than like driving through the shitty part of Detroit, which people do. It's just you don't stop for nothing, and you make sure that you've got one in the chamber.
Yeah. Okay. Were there any gun restrictions imposed by the government, or were there already some existing?
So he discusses there kind of being an availability of firearms. I'm not super familiar with like specifically Argentine gun laws. I don't think that they enacted any additional restrictions. If you kind of read between the lines, it sounds like it was available if you knew a guy, and like everybody kind of knew a guy.
And people were willing to, on both sides, look the other way. I mean, they just wouldn't abide by it if it's the question of my family's safety. I don't fucking care. I'm gonna defend myself and my family.
And it, guns are kind of expensive as well, and they tend to be. I guess Argentina does have a couple of domestic manufacturers, but like your baseline Glock is like $500. That's like not an inexpensive purchase.
Were there any shortages of anything? Whether
he discusses
types of weapons or ammunition.
Yeah, he discusses, and I've heard actually, I forget the source, but somebody who had some job in I think Colombia, the standard way that he would make sure that he was friends with the police was to buy them a couple of boxes of ammunition because it was extremely expensive for their paycheck and not necessarily provided to them by the government in any quantities.
Where would you buy that sort of thing in that scenario?
Oh, I think it was literally like it was available at like whatever their like firearms like store was. It was just like too expensive for the local cops.
Now, in that scenario, it's not like it's illegal, so like the customs officers aren't going to stop importation of 7.62 by 39, whatever the AK round is. But in like a civil war situation, all the ports are going to be controlled by some party, right?
Yeah, I mean, civil war is kind of out of scope of the, in that sort of scenario, there's just too many scenarios. But yeah, I mean the United States is armed to the teeth already. Like,
Right.
it's not even like they're at one point. I think like a month ago they were trying to push this study that half of the guns are like owned by like 1% of the population or something, which was respondents to a voluntary survey, but. I can speak from experience that, in an area where it's part of the culture, it's, armed to the teeth is a pretty good description, and like having 10,000 rounds of whatever in your basement is not all that uncommon. So, like, I don't think that like any restriction like would be like successful in kind of keeping people's just in case supplies down. And this was even like the case in kind of the former Yugoslavia. Like everybody still has an old like Mauser or whatever like in their basement, and enough Mauser food to make a good show of it.
What about communications? Were there any restrictions on telephones, internet? I mean, the internet wasn't as big back then, but...
Yeah, he doesn't discuss the internet. As far as phone networks go, there were occasional outages, again, just like related to like equipment being out. It was more the kind of expense associated with it. Like in a lot of Argentine country, or a lot of, I think every Latin American country actually, you pay for every minute that you spend on the phone if you are the caller but not the receiver, something like that. So, just because of the expense, you try to limit phone communications, and you don't go out of your way to like call up people unless it's kind of an emergency. But
So you didn't talk about cell phones. I mean, again, it's probably not as...
Yeah, I mean, this was like the mid-90s, I think, that he... No, obviously not. Yeah, the 2001...
Early 2000s.
Yeah, early 2000s. So, I don't know that was even as common back then.
Really? Okay.
Well, I know that Russia did not have very well-developed internet as of like 2007. So I think it's a safe bet that Argentina, which is kind of similar in GDP per capita, maybe even lower.
I mean, U.S.
I don't think they would have had internet.
Depending on what scenario you're talking about in the U.S., like the U.S. internet infrastructure is ridiculously vulnerable. Like there's probably about like 20,000 people or so in the U.S. who just like on their own could cause like a multi-hour outage. If you like expand that to like needing to get half dozen people together, it's kind of amazing that it like works at all. And that's sort of, nobody really profits from like knocking out the internet or knocking out particular sites. But
there could be just some terrorist act that is designed to damage the society with no other goal than that.
I mean, it would seem more likely
or
to
a false
me.
flag.
It would seem more likely to me that like somebody would decide like we need to like shut down the internet in this area, and like the easiest way to do that is to basically cause like a mass outage or like an outage of some major service, like Twitter or Vimeo or something.
Well, I wanted to ask about the role of the military. Did they impose any martial law? Was it used at all to kind of hold order? Because I know that they had like a pot and pan revolution. Where a bunch of Argentinians went out into the streets and beat their pots and pans, and they called for the prime minister or president to step down, and it worked. And it wasn't like your typical Latin American revolution where you have fighter jets firing at the government buildings. I think that happened in Chile with
helicopters.
Argentina has a pretty... I think that their military did not... Like, whenever you talk about, like, martial law, that requires, like, your kind of civil authorities to, like, want to impose it, and it requires your military authorities to be like, okie dokie, that sounds like a great idea. But, I mean, typically the way that you advance in the military, like, you don't win any brownie points from like being like the general who gets known as like the butcher of X. It's like you got yourself into this situation. Maybe you should get yourself out of it. Like, we're not going to send the 101st Airborne to go shoot looters in Manassas or whatever.
Well, a lot of people speculate as to the loyalty of the U.S. military and its composition influencing that as well. And the military's changed quite a bit demographically, setting even aside this stupid Obama administration putting transsexuals into the military. I mean, it's just racially changed quite a bit, as well as having females in the infantry. I've heard that the Navy and the Air Force are still predominantly good old boys, quote unquote, but the real issue in kind of a collapse scenario is going to be your infantry. I don't think the Navy, obviously the Navy's not going to be used too much, and the Air Force as well. So it's going to be the Army and the Marines.
Yeah, Glenn Reynolds actually has a pretty good article, the Instapundit guy, talking about kind of how robust the U.S. like anti-coup machinery, which is like probably also your like anti-martial law machinery is. The sort of like core infantry is like 100% good old boys, essentially, and they're all like they're primarily kept overseas. When they are like domestic, they're like almost completely disarmed while they're on base, with like very tight restrictions, actually, from what I understand, on the kind of weaponry that's available to them.
I've heard that military bases don't even have ammunition on site.
Yeah, and that's
So who controls that? There must be some supply depot.
Yeah,
they have to dispatch.
they keep them like sort of dispersed. The effect of this is that if you're just like some rando general, you're like in a geographic position,
Right.
like you can't, if you like control the whatever the that Marine base is that's closest to Washington D.C., you're like logistically unable to get enough like dudes with loaded rifles to do anything. Now
What's to stop their civilian? Well, I guess they all.
Yeah, I mean, all these NATO rounds you can buy at Walmart.
Right.
Yeah. The counterpoint to that is that like there's a reason why the U.S. has been like investing incredibly heavily in these like federal paramilitary groups, like the ATF, like the frickin' EPA owns massive quantities of weaponry. Like the Department of Homeland Security and its various like component agencies, like they've been stockpiling and actually increasing their.
DHS is weird because they must be just like the CIA or something. Because like, when was the last time you met a DHS agent? I mean, they must be kind of in plain clothes at Starbucks, and every other like store around the world, the country.
What are the TSA? Are they DHS? Or?
Yeah, TSA is DHS. DHS is like a grab bag of like unaccountable shit that like all of their parent agencies wanted to get rid of in 2004. Plus like all the new crap that they've accreted onto there. But that would be
your are functionally retarded, right?
Yeah, that would be kind of who you would expect to see, kind of as like a mechanism for enforcing order, quote unquote. And it's not actually all that uncommon to like call out the National Guard either. In these sorts of scenarios, like I mean, they certainly did in the Los Angeles riots after Hurricane Katrina, the hurricane that hit New York,
Hurricane Sandy.
Hurricane Sandy, yeah. Doing like
but that's part of their primary function is actually disaster relief,
right? And it's questionable kind of how effective they would be in a sort of long-term or like quasi counterinsurgency role. Like they sort of learned a lot of lessons from the LA riots, where there was a lot of concern amongst the army leadership that like in retrospect it would have been very easy for like it to have turned into a complete shit show where you had the butcher of LA getting frog marched.
Well, the National Guard, as I understand it, is first under the jurisdiction of the states from which they come.
Yeah.
And then does that somehow...
Well,
obviously, during Iraq, they were called up to serve.
Yeah, it's federalizing.
Does the Army have first jurisdiction over them?
It's complicated, and like in a situation where it mattered, you'd see some contention. But the governors can call them out. They can also be federalized and called up by the president. They have kind of a parallel command structure, but it's obviously very linked into the Department of Defense, and that's like how you get promoted, not by getting approval from your state governor. I don't think that like state governors tend to be like in much contact with their National Guard troops. And
well, I think the governor of Texas actually...
Yeah, he's got his state guard.
He, maybe that's different though, but he did something I think maybe during Jade Helm.
Yeah.
I remember he made them monitor the.
Well, that was Texas has its own like kind of secondary National Guard, the Texas Guard that actually you can enlist directly in and is not part of the Department of Defense. But
that's very cool.
That's just Texas being Texas.
Yeah. Texas actively promotes a sort of nationalism.
Right.
But to kind of loop it back to their employment in a time of distress, like the kind of National Guard commanders, when they do end up deploying in kind of unrest situations, at least currently the doctrine is basically they are to like be a enormous mass of warm bodies and to do absolutely nothing. So like they're
show force, to show
yeah, just like plop a brigade of 400 or however many people that is. It's more than 400.
I don't know.
Plop a company, I guess, and some intersection, and be like, okay, nobody's getting through this intersection.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to crack heads from the stadies, then like they can do that.
I do remember watching George H.W. Bush give a television address where he called the National Guard in to control the LA riots.
Yeah, and that was...
I don't remember exactly what happened, but I remember him saying that.
So that's the exact reason why they're reluctant to do anything more than just like showing force.
So what happened?
So they had a lot of situations where they would take like a National Guard squad, they would attach them to a police squad, and they were like kind of rolling around neighborhoods, and there were quite a few instances where the LA cops were going to kick down a door, and they said something like "cover me," which the National Guard took as
covering fire.
Yeah, took as suppressing fire instruction. Lit the place up.
Oh my God.
And after a few instances of this, especially when that was such a shit show to begin with, because you had all these spurious reports of like taking sniper fire, which of course was completely false. It was people being very jittery, but like
somebody heard a gunshot.
Somebody heard a gunshot. Somebody heard the next squad over like shooting at something that they thought that they heard, and like imagine giving like a paranoid
today,
LA cop the ability to like call in an airstrike.
Today with drones everywhere, honestly, I think it would be a lot better. But I don't think it hesitate to deploy if there was a situation like LA again. I think they would do it. I mean,
I think they would deploy, but I think they would be remarkably ineffective. Because their like institutional incentive is not to like go in and crack heads.
Right.
Their institutional incentive is like the National Guard went in and then like now we're serious like.
So
right, and who is in the National Guard?
And it's like how much incentive do they have to like go and like everybody remembers like Kent State too, and the lesson from that is like even when you're getting pelted with rocks, you don't necessarily want to be the guy that they photograph shooting into a crowd.
Yeah,
right. I mean, these guys are just typical American sort of middling schlubs, right?
Well, they call them weekend warriors. They call them weekend warriors. They hold down 9 to 5, and then they're required to go in and serve, I think, 2 days or 4 days a month, something like that, or maybe like a week every 2 months. And then, of course, if there's like a national emergency, that changes. But that's their typical rotation. And you can join, I think, up until like 35. So they're typically older, and that's just the join date that you can stay in it after that point. So they're typically older. They're typically, like family people.
From what I've heard, a lot of them actually have sort of their normal employment, quote unquote, is also often security related. So you'll see like a lot of cops or prison guards who are also in the National Guard.
Yeah, it's just a jobs bank, essentially. I mean, I don't know.
But these people typically know how to take maximum advantage of the various federal benefits and National Guard benefits, and they're not these are not the NKVD. You know, they're not going to
No.
really crush people.
No.
But do we have anything else kind of that we wanted to discuss in regards to like alternate plausible scenarios, or like as it pertains to Argentina, or kind of other ground that we want to?
I just wonder. I want to read about what happened in Lebanon, and I want to read about Yugoslavia, because I feel like those are the other ways that this can go down, that we have good sort of natural experiments for.
I'm not familiar with Lebanon too much, but Yugoslavia is interesting. I think it's different than the United States just because we don't have very clearly defined ethnic dividing lines, and that's
ancient rooted societies.
Right. I mean, you could even say that Yugoslavia didn't have clearly defined borders either, but probably a lot more than United States.
But you were a Serb, or you were a
right, Croat,
or whatever. Yeah.
So there's a nice article on Social Matter. I think it's called "The United States Cannot Balkanize,"
That's good.
where they discuss the kind of composition, the ethnic composition in Yugoslavia versus the U.S. And as you said, the U.S. is far more kind of dispersed, and there's a lack of kind of ethnic cohesion. Now, the U.S. ethnicities are also sort of like much broader based. So, like, you know, depending on how you construct like Texanness as a ethnicity, that may or may not be true on like certain scales, but it's kind of a different.
Well, the regional
scenario.
fault lines, I think, is maybe something we can quickly go over if we even can speculate as to where those would be. But I've seen a few maps, and I would sort of tend to agree generally with there is kind of a Pacific Northwest Cascadia region. There is probably a northeastern region. The Midwest kind of is another region. The Southwest could basically just go to Mexico, and then the old South could just break away.
There's like all these things kind of tend to happen not from like first principles of what kind of would make sense in terms of geographic breakdowns. Like, it always seems to be kind of, you know, there's some spark where like some area like says, you know, so long, see you later, and then you have the sort of responses to that, but it's very path dependent. And it's not necessarily like, you know, everything kind of centrifuges all at once. You know, people talk about like the, you know, Texas seceding or something, but I question, you know, how likely that would be specifically because it's such a focal area, as opposed to like these sort of like soft secessions where, you know, Tennessee or something decides that, sorry, like we're just not going to support any federal initiatives. We're not going to assist you in collecting federal taxes, but without like being like, and we're also our own country.
Texas is tough because there's no border around it. There's no. I mean, it's
Texas
artificial.
is not going to succeed.
Yeah, I don't believe it will.
I think you need to be in the
I've
mountains.
seen these presumably. Actually, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are advertisements on Facebook for the Texit, they call it, #Texit. And I have to think this is just an open society funded thing to collect IP addresses or something.
Yeah, they call that flypaper. It's basically just getting stupid people to put their name on a registry. I wouldn't trust that either.
But like, yeah, most U.S. states are not like geographically defensible or like societally cohesive enough to like do any sort of like, you know, if a state governor was like, we're our own country, that like he would be gone almost immediately. There is a possibility, though, for like forms of like soft secession where you just stop cooperating with the feds.
Well, we had Waco, and Ruby Ridge was a little different because
those weren't.
They just kind of ran at them, but
those weren't instances though of like a state government or even like a local government.
Yeah, but I think that's more likely. I think you're just going to have regions where just like I'm just flying the Jefferson flag.
I can see
now.
the whites in the deep south. We're talking Alabama, Mississippi. I could see
Appalachia's just been fucked so hard. They're what do they have to lose? You know.
Or there's always like
Northern New England is also remarkably white. We're talking Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine.
Free State Project.
Remarkably white, actually fairly cohesive and isolated. Like there's not a lot of interstate highways that go into New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine. There's like 4 highways. It's tough to get up there. So in the event that the feds, weren't willing to inflate and they had to put all the tax money into the debt, let's say, and where non-whites don't want to live in upper northern New England and upstate New York because of the winter, maybe that happens. Maybe they start cooperating with the government of Quebec or something.
There's also like the scenario where you have a local breakdown in order and a local restoration in order that does not involve the U.S. government. So, like for instance, if you have things get disrupted somehow so much that like the feds are effectively no longer able to say some hurricane manages to wipe out large parts of Florida, and being a swamp, it's not exactly passable terrain. If you have local communities kind of that were unaffected or managed to reconstruct, say you're some dude chilling on Key West, the Key West government is functionally independent, and depending on kind of what's going on in the larger world, when the feds get back down there, they might or might not be great to be back. Okay, so we've now gone almost to the precipice of FEMA camps.
I don't think anybody that I know would voluntarily go into one of those things.
And now we're there. Oh, yeah, I really don't want to go down that road.
Well, I mean, there have been rumors that the feds are actually collecting information on the approximately 3 to 4 million Russian speakers in the U.S. I don't know what.
That would be smart. I'm
worried.
I wish they were collecting information on the 30 million Spanish speakers.
Right.
Yeah, no kidding.
All these Russians coding and working at, I don't know,
Goldman Sachs and stealing high frequency trading codes.
Yeah, it's weird. There's all these guys in Brighton Beach
doing chess algorithms.
Yeah, but going much further than describing we've discussed kind of a civil unrest scenario, a natural disaster scenario, several kind of economic scenarios. Is there anything else that we wanted to cover? Kind of other stuff just to kind of stir the pot?
I think some of this can be...
I will throw this out there.
If
I may. Sorry. Endgame, do you want to go?
Real quick, I'm just going to say that some of this stuff can be discussed offline, and probably we shouldn't say anything, that we don't want others, taking the wrong inspiration from. But I would just say that, bottom line, don't trust what you see from the authorities, and you have to have a way to be independent. That's sort of my go-to instinct, and however you want to do that is my advice. That's what I would like to try to figure out. Ultimately, I'd like to be independent from essentially anything that I require right now, whether it be electricity, food, water. Long term, I'd like to just be, I don't really care. You guys do what you want. And then I find like-minded people like that in the community, and I think that's the way forward.
So I'd like to have like a river castle kind of like German Baron style. I'd like to have like a big ass chain across like the Missouri River or something, and a castle, and just
Sure,
like collect
of
my
course.
tolls. Like, you know, maybe have some peasants, but like that's the kind of self-sufficiency I could get behind.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what are your guys' top 3 recommendations to be urbanite settlement?
Just have like a week of food and water on hand. Like, it's so easy,
Alright.
and like, you know, like at some point this came up in some other context at work, and like, you know, these people making well into the 6 figures, like, you know, do you know how cheap it is to like have like,
Yeah.
you know, 50 gallons of water?
Yeah,
and,
if I can add,
30
to
meals.
just add to what he just said, do it now, because if something does happen, number one, the prices are going to go up, and number two, you probably can't even get it for stock out reasons or logistical reasons or for security reasons. You don't want people knowing that you're trying to get it, because you also don't want people to know that you have things. So I would say do it now, do it discreetly, and then in terms of what you should get, food, water number one, food number two, and then 3, self-defense.
I say what you do is you get a Berkey water filtration system, something like $200 to $300. You can filter the Ganges through that thing, and it's drinkable.
Yeah, but have you ever gone out in the woods? You know, like having a bucket brigade isn't so easy in practicality speaking. So I would say get.
No, but you run your bathtub. I mean, keep water too if you can.
Yeah,
You should
Like,
have. You should
water's
have.
cheap. Like,
Water,
all the
5
stuff
gallon,
is,
5
like,
gallon. You know,
it's just
jugs
like
and
you know,
jerrycans
the
and-
Red Cross, like just the Red Cross like disaster preparedness guidelines. Like they say like exactly this stuff. Like, especially if you live in an area that's prone to like floods or hurricanes or earthquakes or whatever. Like it's extremely basic bitch stuff. It's completely intuitive. And its job is just to like keep you alive until like the cavalry comes, or so that you can like drive out if the roads are screwed up and it takes you 5 times longer than usual.
Yeah, and some people say to have bug out bags on hand. I've never really subscribed to that, just for the fact that I don't know exactly what scenario is going to unfold. But I would say have the components of a bug out bag sort of in your possession, and then have a bag that you can fill up with what you need as the situation requires.
Sure. I mean, I recently was in Costco,
Yeah.
and I picked up 16 pounds of rice or something. This enormous bag of rice, and
For like a dollar.
I would say
for
canned food is probably the better
rice
way.
is
but-
rice is nice because it's like if you're cook at all, like then that's just part of your rotation. So it's really easy to just like keep like, you know, some dehydrated rice, and it's the cheapest calories you can get.
Yeah, but you have to cook it, and so that requires the heat source
You
and
can soak it.
the pots and come on. No, I think cans are the best. Personally, you can get vegetables, you can get chili, you can get beans, you can get meat. Cans is my
honey is unbeatable in terms of a
calories. Yeah,
Make sure that you get
Not
the
nutrition.
hippie honey and not the stuff that comes in the Bear container. That's just Chinese corn syrup.
Oh, dude, I'm buying raw,
Yeah.
super organic, of course.
Yeah, try to get it in the buckets from like your local apiary.
Cool.
All right.
Sweet.
So on that
Unintended.
note, every buckets of water, buckets of food, buckets of honey, and buckets of bullets. If you're into that kind of thing.
Keep the bears away.
Yeah, strictly for anti-bear purposes.
Bear patrol.
But on that note, I think we've probably covered. We're nearing the hour and a half mark here, and I think we covered a good amount of stuff.
Yeah, be safe, everybody. This is the most interesting period of my life in terms of politics and a lot of other things. So I think everybody should just stay calm and whatever. May we live in interesting times.
Amen.
All right.